Hi there, I'm Alan Ackman, and you're watching Developing a Crisis Management Plan, part of the larger course on crisis communication, communicating with colleagues. This specific module is going to talk about one of the most critical pieces of internal crisis communication, the Crisis Management Plan. The first thing to mention is that when I use the term Crisis Management Plan in this module, I'm not talking about a plan in the abstract. I'm talking about a physical, tangible, written document that may or may not be printed, but is certainly reproducible and able to be distributed or made available to all members of a crisis management team. This is a really critical point because a lack of a plan causes chaos. A company is made up of a lot of individual people, and when a crisis occurs, if there's no actual strategy, everyone just sort of moves around randomly, trying to figure out where they're supposed to be and handling logistical problems. An existing plan, however, helps with organization. When a crisis occurs, everybody goes and references the document and knows exactly what steps they need to take. So, what's in a crisis management plan? Well, this module is going to cover the main sections that should usually be included. Though it isn't comprehensive and you should feel free to enhance or expand the elements of the plan according to your specific situation, even the most bare-bones management plans usually have the following elements: a cover page, an introduction, a first action page, a risk assessment section, an incident report section, a communication strategy section, a business continuity section, and a post-crisis evaluation form. We're going to be discussing each of these in detail over the next several clips, so let's go ahead and get right to it. This clip is going to discuss the cover page to a crisis management plan. A crisis management plan needs to have a cover page, and not just for reasons of professional appearance and accessibility. A cover page is also critical for privacy reasons. As we'll discuss momentarily, a crisis management plan often contains high-level strategy information regarding mission-critical elements of how an organization operates, as well as written discussion of the organization's potential vulnerabilities. And that's not something you want people to just stumble across or to distribute without cause. Additionally, a crisis management plan often contains details about how previous crises were resolved and who was impacted by those crises. Sometimes there are legal implications to unauthorized distribution of those details, so potential readers need to be made aware of those variables before deciding whether to open the document. Here's what a cover page needs to contain. First, the crisis management plan needs to be titled as such, and titled prominently, generally in the center of the document. Equally prominent should be a confidentiality statement, explicitly stating that the contents of the document are solely the concern of the crisis management response team, or whomever the organization decides needs to have access to the document. It also urges people in possession of the document to treat it carefully and not distribute it without authorization. If appropriate, you should feel free to run the text of the confidentiality statement through legal counsel for approval. Authorship can be indicated, if appropriate, though in the case of collective authorship it isn't necessarily critical. There's also going to be the date that the document was completed, as well as any dates it was revised, so that readers can quickly identify whether they are using the most current version of the plan, as well as whether the plan might need to be reviewed and updated. Finally, if the document has been printed in hard copy, some teams elect to indicate how many copies have actually been made, which helps identify whether any copies have gone rogue. The next major section is the introduction, so let's talk about that now. This clip is going to discuss the introduction to a crisis management plan. The introduction is the first thing a reader encounters after the title page, and consequently it sets the tone and expectations for the document itself. Here are a few elements that often appear in the introduction. First, the introduction should set up the purpose of the document itself. This usually involves talking a bit about how the document came to be, what problems it is intended to solve, and the occasions in which it should be used. Like all technical writing, the main objective of the document should be clear within the first few sentences. Additionally, an introduction often persuades readers, convincing them to take its contents and objectives seriously. As we've discussed, Crisis management plans are critical parts of making sure that businesses weather their inevitable crises competently, and there can be serious consequences for not being familiar with how to execute the steps contained in the plan itself. The introduction should emphasize these stakes. Finally, introductions often end by providing a brief overview that explains the organization of remaining sections of the document. Some crisis management plans can be quite lengthy, and giving a reader a specific idea of what elements the rest of the document contains can really help them navigate the document with ease. In terms of authorship, this section is often written by high-ranking people within the organization that may or may not be on the specific crisis response team. It's not unusual, in fact, for this section to be written by a CEO, company president, division head, or someone else whose presence or authorship can help communicate the stakes of the plan itself. As for organization, as you might expect, the introduction will go first in a document. In a shorter crisis management plan, it might just be the first few paragraphs, but in a longer one, it can have its own set of pages. The next major section is the first action section, so let's talk about that now. This clip is going to talk about the Crisis Management Plan First Action page, which describes all of the important information required to activate the plan, and therefore set the crisis response team in motion. Here's a bit more about what that section usually contains. The most important part of the plan is probably a description of the conditions under which the plan itself should be activated. Businesses undergo snags or shortfalls regularly, but that doesn't mean that every incident deserves a full-on crisis response. So there should be a very clear account of what will classify as a crisis in the context of this organization and what will not. In addition to the what of classification, there will also be instructions about how the plan should be activated. This includes details about who is designated or authorized to assemble the team, and often includes up-to-date information about who specifically should be contacted, as well as what value they will bring to the team itself. This section often includes up-to-date contact information, including phone numbers or email addresses or of important stakeholders or agencies, such as the police or federal agencies. Basically, it's a centralized place that contains all of the information necessary for rapid response in a situation where minutes matter. In terms of location, this part of the document often appears fairly early in relation to other sections, usually right after the introduction. Also, it should be noted that many writers choose to break this section up into two sections, one containing an account of the plan activation and another being a detailed contact sheet. You can decide for yourself whether this subdivision is necessary, since either option is perfectly in line with the conventions of this kind of document. The next major section is the risk assessment section, so let's talk about that now. This clip is going to talk about the risk assessment section of a crisis management plan and the value such a section adds to the document as a whole. The main benefit to this section is a benefit of preparation. As we've discussed, one of the biggest aspects of crisis preparedness involves identifying and tracking the specific crisis types to which your organization might be most vulnerable. Once that hard work is done, the resulting knowledge is contained for reference here in the risk assessment section. We've already talked about risk assessment at length back in Module 2, so we're going to be brief here. Essentially, this section contains an account of the crisis types your team has decided are most worthy of your attention, either because they're the most likely to happen or because they could have the greatest potential impact on your organization. It also contains an account and assessment of your organization's greatest points of risk and where you think a crisis is most likely to originate. This section also provides a point of reference when the document itself comes up for review, or so that new members of a crisis team can consider how they might respond to various crisis types in advance, and know how to monitor systems and information for potential flashpoints that might need to be extinguished. One quick thing to emphasize. This section is not meant to be a comprehensive account of every crisis type that an organization could possibly face. Only a detailed account of the specific crises that are most worthy of their probable attention, and why. Making such a determination is complicated, of course, so once again, I'm going to refer you to Module 2 for a more detailed account of how to go about the process. In terms of location, This is typically the third element included in a crisis management plan, occurring after the first action section. Now, let's talk about the next major section, which is the incident report section. This clip talks about the incident report section of a crisis management plan and the value that such a section adds to the document as a whole. In this case, I think that the word document is a very important and even very literal word, because the main function of this section is to document the events of past crises and how they were resolved. There's a concept in crisis communication studies known as institutional memory, which describes an organization's ability to record, recall, and apply lessons learned from its past efforts. Ideally, an organization is going to have a strong institutional memory, transferring both successes and failures. Crisis events, though they are certainly dramatic, are actually quite vulnerable to gaps in institutional memory. This is because most organizations hopefully go quite a long while between crises, and it's natural for details to fade. This section of the document therefore catalogs as many details about the previous crises as is reasonably possible, including the date that the crisis hit and how long it was prolonged. Any individuals involved should be named and discussed, as should an objective account of what happened. Hopefully, the report section will include any steps that the organization or individuals took for resolution, as well as copies of any writing that was generated throughout the process. After the writing, there should be some indication of assessment of success and whether the steps taken achieved their respective goals. The value of an incident report section comes into play with situations like the Shuttle Challenger and Columbia explosions. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger tragically exploded on takeoff, and NASA was roundly criticized for how they handled their response, which was seen as vague, fragmented, uncoordinated, and disingenuous. But NASA kept detailed records about what worked and what didn't. Then, in 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. This time, NASA applied what they had learned and used a dedicated spokesman, regular press updates, and clear, consistent communication. The second example of crisis handling was generally viewed as successful. Finally, the incident report section also helps with external audits and reviews, and provides an agreed-upon point of reference should the handling of a crisis ever come under scrutiny by outside agencies like government regulators or civil lawsuits. In such cases, the organization needs to demonstrate that they made every reasonable effort to contain damage resulting from the crisis, which can be useful for limiting future liability or even criminal charges should people start asking questions about, say, whether an accidental crisis might actually have been a preventable one. In terms of location, the incident report section typically follows the risk assessment section. The next major section is the communication strategy section, so let's talk about that now. This clip is going to discuss the communication strategy worksheet and the role it plays in the overall success of a written crisis management plan. The main function of this particular section is to remind team members that crisis communication is above all things strategic and should arise out of the clear interaction between the specific stakeholders that make up the audience, the conditions under which the authoring organization finds itself, and the specific purposes it hopes to achieve, as well as whether those purposes are informational, instructive, or restorative. And for more information about that, you can reference Module 3 of this course. This kind of worksheet can actually take a wide variety of forms, and like other elements, is a function of the organization itself and its needs. It's often going to contain the following, though. First, a series of prompts helping communicators think about an audience's level of knowledge, attitudes, and needs. The more that communicators can reasonably assume about who makes up their audience, the better. This section can also include questions about identifying how many audiences are actually being addressed and which ones are most important at the moment. Next, a communication strategy worksheet is going to include a series of prompts about what specific goals the writers hope their communication will achieve, and which goals are most important given the circumstances in which the organization finds itself. Next, There might be a catalog of possible response types, namely the various strategies of denial, diminishment, rebuilding, and bolstering discussed in Module 3. This section also often indicates which strategies the organization has determined might be the most appropriate in various circumstances. This is so the organization can have all possible response options at its disposal when crafting a message. Finally, there are usually copies of any communication sent out in previous crises, whether it was an email to customers, a message sent to business partners, or a press release to the general public. Taken together, these resources allow teams to craft communications swiftly and strategically, putting them in the best position to succeed. In terms of location, the Communication Strategy worksheet generally follows the Incident Report section. The next major section is the Business Continuity section, so let's talk about that now. This clip is going to discuss the Business Continuity section of a crisis management plan and the contributions such a section can make to the overall document. Business continuity is a generalized term for ensuring that operations remain in effect throughout a truly catastrophic crisis that threatens the very nature of the business model. Here are a couple of examples. The document may contain information about what the organization would or should do in the event of a fire at their manufacturing facility, which would be a threat to physical infrastructure. It might also indicate something of technology infrastructure, like a complete disruption of their physical server farm, or their leadership infrastructure, namely something that renders core leadership inaccessible as a consequence of the crisis. Finally, it might address things like continuity in the event of a sudden breach of stakeholder trust, which threatens security or competency. In other words, it's a specific dimension of the crisis management plan that focuses on large-scale issues. As far as what those types of resolutions should actually be, that's where my advice comes to a stop in this regard. The only people who would know your core business well enough are the people who actually work within your organization. And the steps you actually need to take to ensure business and technical continuity in the face of potential disruptions is a matter for other courses, many of which are also available throughout the Pluralsight library. So for the purposes of this course, you just need to know that this dedicated section of the document identifies what to do in truly worst-case scenarios, or at minimum, points responders to where they can find such information. In terms of location in the document, it's generally going to follow the Communication Strategy section. That covers the major sections of any base-level crisis management plan. There are, however, a few other potential sections that some organizations choose to include, so let's talk about those now. In previous clips, we talked about some of the most common sections of a crisis management plan. Even the most bare-bones crisis management plan should probably contain, or at least consider containing, those sections. But there are a few less than common ones that also make an appearance occasionally. This clip will discuss such sections. The first optional section that sometimes gets included is acknowledgement forms, where all of the people involved with the crisis management plan sign acknowledgements that they've read it and understand its contents, which is a safeguard to make sure the plan has a high likelihood of being activated appropriately. The second optional section is a rehearsal dates page, which includes information about any simulations that might have been run in order to ensure optimal preparedness. You might also include a crisis directory, which has phone numbers of all people involved in a crisis in a very localized and centralized location. You could also have a proprietary information section, which identifies any information that is not to be released under any circumstances, whether that is financial, legal, trade secret, whatever it might be. Finally, some document plans have a Crisis Control Center description, which describes features that meeting place locations in the event of a crisis need to contain in order to be considered functional. These documents, since they're generally considered supplemental, often go at the back pages of a crisis management plan. Here are some of the most important points from Module 5, which focused on the Crisis Communication Management Plan. A crisis communication management plan is the single most important document for ensuring swift and strategic communication within a crisis. There are several reasons for this. The plan provides not only a communication benefit, but a logistic, economic, and protective one as well. Now, despite these benefits, most businesses, regrettably, do not have a crisis communication plan, or if they do have one, do not revise or practice it regularly. The bottom line, though, is that studying the range of sections and elements for a crisis communication management plan can help ensure your own organization handles any crises it might encounter effectively.